As promised, let's talk a bit about how we'd render this donut realistically. And by realistically, I mean using a render engine that allows a single freelancer working on a single workstation to get decent results and have a decent speed in your render engine. And there are several options for third-party rendering engines in Houdini. The most popular ones are Redshift, Arnold, or RenderMan, and maybe V-Ray. And in order to be able to use a third-party rendering engine inside of Houdini, you'll need at least Houdini Indie. So with your default free Houdini Apprentice version, you are not allowed to install third-party render engines. However, Houdini Indie is currently, I think, $270 per year, which I think is a doable investment for a freelancer. And the render engine that I want to talk about today is called 3Delight, an engine which I wasn't really aware of until very recently, although they've been around for a longer time. And historically, they've been offering a RenderMan-compatible rendering engine whose main selling point, I think, was the pricing and the speed. However, for a few years now, they've been developing and pushing that engine. And recently they released a beta version for Houdini. And there are three things that I particularly like about that engine. One, it's relatively fast for a CPU-based engine. Two, they have a really great and extremely simple to use cloud interface for cloud rendering, built straight into their render viewer. So even for me as a single person who does not want to be bothered with configuring or setting up cloud rendering, 3Delight makes it extremely easy to just take your scene, push it on the cloud, and have really, really fast, powerful render nodes there. And third, it's their pricing model, because the basic engine for local rendering up to 12 cores is free. They are just charging you if you push stuff on their cloud. You even get a few credits for free in the beginning, and then just pay per CPU hour. So if you're just starting out using Houdini and just want to kind of get a feel for a third-party engine, I think this is a good starting point. So let's use that to shade and render our donut. After you install 3Delight, you can see the tools that it offers you up here in the 3Delight shelf. And if that is not present, you click on this plus symbol here, go to shelves and check 3Delight. Let's go up one level to the OBJ tab here and let's restore our render layout again by just pinning this tab here and then hitting Ctrl T twice to create those two tabs, setting one to the out context and one to the material context. Let's drag this over and just immediately start our rendering in 3Delight, clicking this render button here. It takes a while to start up, but after a while you're greeted with this, the 3Delight display. That's the IPR window of 3Delight. And you can see our rendering looks a bit gray, so we'll need to tweak the materials or initially create those materials. Let's stop the rendering by hitting this button here. Minimize this. And in our materials tab here, I want to create those 4 materials, just using 3Delight nodes this time. And typically with a third-party render engine, you would use material builders, which are subnets. So you will only end up with one single node per material. However, as 3Delight is still in beta, and I found that to be a bit unreliable, let's just build the shaders straight onto our material level by just hitting tab and then going to our 3Delight group here. In this case, I want to build all our shaders using the principled shader, which should be the implementation of the same shading model that Houdini uses in its principled shader, a shading model developed by Disney a few years ago. So let's call this one dough, copy it, paste it, call this one icing, again, copy and paste it, call this one sprinkles, and finally copy and paste this and call this one BG for background. So those are our shaders. Let's assign them to our objects, going to our torus geometry, and in the material nodes down here, let's assign the respective materials by just clicking here and then selecting them. Icing goes here and the dough finally goes here. Head up one level and do the same thing for our background material just here in the render tab of the material on the OBJ level, and maybe save this. Let's go to our material tab and restart our rendering. And you can see that is still gray because although we assign materials, we haven't tweaked them yet. So let's start off maybe with the icing. That's kind of an easy material. And in our icing that we set up for Mantra, we set up a subsurface scattering component and a diffuse component. So let's just copy those colors over by right-clicking on the base color here, going to copy parameter, and then in our newly created icing material, let's go to our base tab here, and this is my base color. Right click here and go to paste values. Let's restart the rendering here, just making sure we set this to start IPR. Now we can see we have this initial pinkish color of our icing. Let's set up the subsurface by just copying over the subsurface color from our Mantra shader, right clicking here, copy parameter, going into our 3Delight icing material in the subsurface tab, right clicking on the transmittance and pasting those values, and also increasing the subsurface weight to 1. You can see weird things happening here. On the one hand, this is getting greenish a bit, and then we are getting these artifacts here. To counteract that, we want to scale down the subsurface scale here to maybe 0.01, like so. So that makes our subsurface scattering material denser. Also, those lights seem to be a bit dim, so let's go back to our OBJ tab, select those 3 lights, and in the lights tab, let's just use the exposure to increase the light intensity to maybe 4 times what it used to be. Next, in our materials tab, let's maybe set up the background material here. So let's go to our original background material and copy the base color. And then here in our new background material in the base tab, let's just paste this by going to paste values. Okay, got this blue background here. Let's just save this. And of course, this crashed now. However, it didn't take with it the 3Delight rendering. So again, we're still in beta with 3Delight, and sometimes Houdini just crashes when using it. So let's restart Houdini and I'll be back in a second. So we restarted Houdini, and if you get this crash error message that your work has been saved before it crashed, you can find the recent backup of your work when you go to File, Open, and then go to Temp here. Then you see this crashed quite frequently. And let's sort this by last modified, and this should be my latest crash file that it saved before it just died on me. And there we are. So let's restart the rendering, and also let's set up our layout again like this and start our render. And here we are. Okay, so I set up the icing, set up the background material. Let's set up the dough material. Stop this, minimize this. And again, to just work on the dough, I want to just highlight the dough by itself and not the icing, not the sprinkles. So I'll go into my torus geometry here and just highlight the material, the dough. And in my dough material, I want to set up that it reads the diffuse color of the points that we set on the mesh here. And for that, we cannot use the default Houdini nodes. We have to use the nodes that the third-party render engine supplies us with. So by right-clicking in here, going to 3Delight, and then selecting attribute read, I can drop down a node which is able to read any attribute here on the mesh. In our case, it's called CD, color diffuse, and the color diffuse we're reading in here goes into our base color. Let's re-render. And there we have it. We're reading in the color of our mesh and using it in our shading. Okay, I think I can dial in the roughness here a bit. So under the base tab, let's just increase our roughness a tiny bit to say 0.5 and re-render this. Yeah, that's a bit better. And now let's add some of this fine structure in here. And in this case, I don't want to use a bump map, as I found this to be working only when I have UVs applied on my mesh here, which I don't currently, and which I think is due to the fact that 3Delight is still in beta. However, but instead I want to use displacement. So I want to actually displace the geometry with a fine detail noise, which I can set up in my bump normal displacement slot here by setting up my type of displacement to the actual displacement. And I want to center this around a 0.5 value because I want to pipe in a noise in here, which goes from 0 to 1. So 0.5 should be the midpoint, and anything below it will be pushed inwards. Anything above it will be pushed outwards. Let's wire a noise in here by hitting tab, going to 3Delight, and then the auxiliary utility nodes are hidden under the Maya subfolder here, which I find kind of a weird decision. However, as 3Delight is still in beta, that might change. Who knows? In here, the noise that I want to use is called volume noise because I want to use a noise that is position-based in a three-dimensional space, which this node gives me. It generates an output color, which I will wire in my displacement normal bump value. And you can see we really drastically changed the geometry and displaced the geometry quite a bit. A bit too much for my tastes. So let's just dial back the intensity here to first 0.1, which still is very strong. So let's dial it back further. 0.02, still too strong. 0.01. Yeah, I think I can live with that. Right, finally, let's set up the subsurface of this dough by going to the subsurface tab and just increasing the subsurface weight. And I think for this rendering, we can leave the rest set as its default here. Okay, let's go back to our OBJ level and re-enable all the geometry, resulting in this weird rendering. So let's just refresh the rendering here, just stop it and then hit render. That's one thing that you're going to see with third-party render engines. Not always will the material update or the geometry update work reliably. So sometimes with any third-party render engine, you have to manually stop and restart the engine for it to refresh the materials or the changes you made reliably. So that's already looking nicely. Let's finally tackle the sprinkles up here. And again, I'll want to use an attribute read to read in the point colors on those sprinkles. So we'll just copy this node here, paste it, and then wire it up into our base color for the sprinkle material. And now we can see the colors coming along nicely. And maybe let's add some subsurface for those sprinkles as well by wiring in the point color, not only into our base color, but also into our subsurface color like this. And then on the subsurface tab, let's increase the weight to say 0.5. Let's see how that looks. And maybe let's draw a render region. So let's focus in this region here and just render those sprinkles here. And I think I need to dial back the subsurface scale a good bit. Yeah, like that. That is looking convincing. All right, let's stop the rendering and switch that to re-rendering instead of IPR, which means we're now using final rendering mode. And we can still see a bit of noise down here, so let's dial that in our out context on the 3Delight node here. When we drag that down here, we can see 3Delight is really easy to set up. Currently, we're only doing 2 diffuse bounces and 2 reflection bounces, which we could arguably maybe dial up, so let's increase them to 4. And also in our shading samples, let's maybe increase them to 128 to get rid of that noise and restart the rendering. Yeah, and that's already looking really great. So while this is converging, let me just mention that there's a bunch of third-party render engines, of which I mentioned a few in the beginning. All of those have their advantages and disadvantages, and whichever engine you choose kind of depends on the environment you're working in, on your special needs, on your hardware requirements, etc., etc. We personally have been working with Redshift over the past few years, because it's a really, really fast engine, which runs on your GPU instead of your CPU. And also we have a premium course running on rendering, which heavily uses Redshift. So if you want to go into that, you might want to support us on Patreon. And to all of you guys already supporting us, thanks a ton. This all is not possible without you. And a very special thank you going out to Gearbox Studio Quebec, Important Looking Pirates, Chris Hebert, and Rafik Anadol. Thanks so much for supporting us.